The first setting in the graphics menu is window mode. Here you can toggle between full screen, borderless, and windowed. You won't see a big difference in frame rates, but you'll be able to Alt-Tab a little easier out of borderless, and you might have a more consistent experience with full screen. When it comes to display resolution, I'm heavily limited by my CPU in 720p, 1080p, and a bit in 1440p. The frame rate drop really only happens at 4K, but it is significant. If you have a less powerful CPU, you'll see this earlier. Resolution scale is like resolution, but worse. The equivalent to 720p is hilariously pixelated. 1080p doesn't look as bad, 1440p is reasonable, and of course 100% would be full native 4K, which looks very sharp. These next settings don't really affect your frame rate other than limiting it. VSync, you've got two options, match refresh rate or off. Frame rate limit will give you 120, 60, or 30, but you'll keep it uncapped, obviously, if you have a faster refresh rate. Show frames per second will put it in the top right, where show VRAM is supposed to also put it in the top right, but mine has only said 0 out of 0, so... We've got a reasonable first-person field of view slider in this game. It will slide you from 70 to 100 degrees. It's not going to give you a very big difference in frame rate, so you can probably set this wherever you want, but if you want to maximize your performance, then you're going to want to keep it somewhere in the 70 to 85 range. And you guessed it, third-person field of view is the same as first-person field of view, but in third person. This also doesn't affect your frame rate too much, but there is a bit of a loss, so if you want performance, put it lower. I've always been an advocate of turning off motion blur if the game allows it, and this game is no exception. It is pretty brutal when you have it turned on. I've got the character spinning here, and when you pause it, you can see how much blur there really is. Screen space reflections is a setting that I would consider pretty important for graphical fidelity. This only has two settings on and off, but you can see it makes a pretty insane impact when you're looking at reflective surfaces. The only really big drawback with screen space reflections has been around for a long time in that it can be blocked by things like trees overhanging the water, and it can only reflect what you see in the camera. So if you're looking down, it will stop reflecting the landscape until you look back at the landscape. And performance impact exists, but it's not incredibly significant. View distance quality affects pop-in of grass and other foliage you see in the distance. It's pretty bad when you're on low, so I would suggest keeping it at least on medium if you can. There isn't much of a performance impact until you get into the high and ultra, in which case it's just about the same between the two settings. Effects quality is always a pretty tough one to test, so I chose Fire for this one. I did notice that you get heat distortion effects starting around high and continuing to ultra with a little bit more distortion. But beyond that, low and medium look very similar to each other, and high and ultra also look very similar to each other. I looked pretty hard at the difference with the logs and the flame atronach and didn't see much of a difference other than the heat distortion. There's a good chance that it impacts other effects more than fire. Foliage quality is basically the amount of grass you have in your scene and the variation of grass you have in your scene. So going from low to high, you'll see a more dense environment, but you'll also see more grass types as you put the setting higher. Frame rate impact in my game was surprisingly minimal for the difference in image quality it made. You can see a pretty big difference when you get up into the high settings compared to medium and low. So if you can afford it, definitely keep it around high. Shadow quality marks the biggest frame rate impact yet, and also has a pretty big issue with low shadows. For some reason in 4K, if you turn the shadows to low, they will flicker like crazy. So you have to keep it at least on medium, but even medium will flicker in some situations. So if you play in 4K, you're basically limited to high or ultra, but if you play at other resolutions, then you've got a little bit more versatility. Global illumination quality was another tough one to test because the environment changes so much with different lighting conditions. But as far as I can tell, it's going to have a lot to do with the ambient occlusion in the game and also the color cast that the sun and other lighting will give the environment you're in. So you'll see deeper, darker shadows in the corners and under tables and things like that. And if you have sunlight coming through a window, you'll see a warmer glow or reflection on the ceiling because of that global illumination. This is one of those very subtle effects that if you look at it on its own doesn't seem to add a huge amount to the game, but when it gets combined with all the other graphic settings, it will make an impactful difference in your image. Only when you get to Ultra do you really see a huge frame rate drop. Texture quality doesn't seem to make much of a difference with textures near to the camera, but it does make a big difference with textures that are further from the camera. It also seems to affect the anisotropic filtering of the game. So if you want sharper textures in the distance and you have like a 12 gigabyte graphics card, then definitely turn this to higher ultra. Reflection quality is one that you might want to combine with screen space reflections, but this will give generic reflections to the water when you get to the high and ultra settings and will reflect a little bit more of the sky on medium. The frame rate drop doesn't really happen until higher ultra, but neither does the nicer looking graphics. I could not find a difference in hair quality anywhere. I looked at the sleeping rat, I looked at fur shields, I looked pretty much everywhere, and if you know what the difference is, please let me know in the comments. Cloth quality will directly impact the physics of the clothes that you are wearing, so when you're on low, there will be no cloth physics. Medium is when things will start to move around a little bit, and high and ultra just make the animations more smooth and seems to add more motion. Lumen is another super tough one to test because everything seems to change a little bit every time you pause and change settings. But you can see when you turn on hardware Lumen, you'll see more shadows again, better ambient occlusion, and more lights reflecting off things like brick walls. So especially around the left, the cabinet had more shadows behind it. And in this scene, the bed will have a warmer light from the window to the right. And when you get to Ultra especially, you'll see just an overall warmer glow to the room because of that window coming from the right. There's a few different anti-aliasing modes in this game, ranging from FXAA to TAA to TSR. So TAA and FXAA will soften your image a bit, where TSR will sharpen it because it's using a super resolution, but it does give you a bigger performance hit. Now, personally, I'm a pretty big fan of upscaling with DLSS or FSR, depending on what graphics card you have. NVIDIA in particular has gotten so good with their upscaling that a lot of the time it looks even better than native, in my opinion. Another perk of the upscaling technology is that it lets you use frame generation, which I know, it's a big topic of discussion these days, but I truly do believe that if you have a high refresh rate monitor, you're doing yourself a disservice if you're not using frame generation with a high-end graphics card. The experience is just so much more smooth when you have it enabled. This game is barely playable if you don't, in my opinion, especially if you're shooting for all ultra settings. You can see that it's going to give you a huge boost in frame rate. It essentially doubles it every time, so I think that it's worth it. Now on to comparing low versus ultra settings, you're going to see about a 63% drop in frame rate if you go from the lowest to the highest settings in the game. There's obviously a pretty dramatic difference in image quality when you go from the lowest to the highest settings, but there is a sweet spot where you get a lot of the graphical fidelity without losing all of the frame rate. Honestly though, nothing really beats ultra settings in the new Unreal games. Everything looks pretty put together, very atmospheric, and it really did justice to the original look of the game. I decided to throw together some more optimized settings for people if you're having trouble putting the game together to a runnable state without losing all of your image quality. So I omitted some of the things that are really heavy on frame rate, like hardware Lumen and some of the ultra and higher shadows, but tried to keep as many of the settings that give the game its charm without losing all of your frame rate. So I'll go through the whole settings list here. First off, I do like having VSync on because you get rid of screen tearing. All of this stuff is pretty much not going to affect what you're doing, but I prefer a higher field of view for my games. You can put that at whatever makes you feel good. I turn off motion blur and then keep screen space reflections on because you don't want to lose that. View distance quality, I like to keep it high just because the grass popping gets pretty distracting. Effects quality didn't have enough of an impact on frame rate, so put that at high. Foliage quality, medium. Shadow quality, medium, because ultra destroys your frame rate. Global illumination I put on high because I didn't see a big difference between low, medium, and high. Texture quality, keep that on medium just to preserve some of your VRAM. Unless you have more, then turn it higher. Reflection quality on high to get the effects from more reflections in the water. Post-processing, it's going to be like vignetting and stuff. You can keep that on low. Hair quality, put it on high, didn't see a difference. Cloth quality, I do like the physics, so I turn that on high as well. If you have an upscaling method that you prefer, I recommend you use it, but I usually use DLSS on quality with my sharpness somewhere around the middle. Keep frame generation on if you want that high frame rate, and go ahead and get the game started. I tested everything on the lowest setting so that there was no influence from any other setting while I was testing. And the only setting that I changed during the test is the setting that I was testing. I basically went to 3 or 4 places in the game and tested the frame rate impact on each setting at low, medium, high, and ultra. Averaged them all together to get the graphs that were shown. If you guys have any questions or issues, I'd love to hear from you. Leave them in the comments, like, subscribe, and we'll see you on the next one.